The rope bit into her wrists like the teeth of judgment itself, and Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as the crowd's hatred pressed against her like desert heat. They had stripped away more than her dignity. They had torn the very fabric of justice from this God-forsaken settlement, leaving only the raw wound of their fear. The wooden post stood like a monument to their collective madness, and she could taste the dust of their accusations on her cracked lips. When Garrett's blade sang through the air and severed her bonds, she thought salvation had finally arrived. But the silver locket that tumbled free from her torn bodice would shatter more than chains. It would break open a truth that had been buried for 20 years. Subscribe to witness the moment when a rescue becomes a revelation that changes everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement of Bitter Creek, but there was no warmth in its light as it fell upon the wooden post that had been erected in the town square overnight. Sarah Mitchell stood with her chin raised, though her hands trembled behind her back where the coarse rope had already begun to chafe against her skin. The crowd had gathered like vultures, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from fear dressed up as faith. She could smell their sweat, their unwashed bodies pressed close in their eagerness to witness what they called justice, and she knew that reason had long since fled this place like water from a broken well. The accusations had started 3 weeks ago when the first crops began to wither in the fields, their green promise turning to brown despair under a sun that seemed to burn with unusual cruelty. Old Martha Henley had been the first to whisper the word that would seal Sarah's fate, pointing a gnarled finger at the woman who had dared to live alone on the outskirts of their settlement, who had refused their offers of marriage and their demands for conformity. The whispers had grown into murmurs, the murmurs into shouts, and now those shouts had become the roar of a mob that would not be satisfied until blood soaked the dust beneath their feet. Sarah had seen this madness before, in other towns, other places where fear had taken root and grown into something monstrous and hungry. The settlement's self-appointed preacher, a man named Josiah Crane, whose eyes held the cold fire of fanaticism, stepped forward with his leather-bound Bible clutched against his chest like armor. His voice carried across the square with the authority of someone who had never questioned his own righteousness, never wondered if the God he claimed to serve would approve of what was about to unfold in his name. The words he spoke were familiar ones, pulled from ancient texts and twisted to fit the shape of their modern hatred, and Sarah felt each syllable like a stone thrown at her heart. She had committed no crime except the sin of being different, of refusing to bend her will to theirs, of living as a free woman in a world that demanded her submission. Behind Crane stood the men who had dragged her from her small cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces hidden behind the masks of their own cowardice, unwilling to meet her eyes now that daylight had stripped away the cover of night. They had torn her dress in their eagerness to search for the devil's marks they were certain they would find, leaving her exposed to their hungry stares and crude comments, reducing her to nothing more than an object of their twisted desires and religious fervor. The women of the settlement watched from the edges of the crowd, their silence more damning than any accusation, their complicity written in the way they averted their eyes from what was being done in their name. Sarah understood that she was not just being punished for her supposed crimes, but for the crime of showing them what they could never be, truly free. The rope around her wrists had been tied by hands that shook with excitement rather than duty, and she could feel the splinters from the rough wooden post pressing against her back through the thin fabric of her torn chemise. The crowd pressed closer, their breath hot and eager, their voices rising in a chant that had nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with the ancient human hunger for violence sanctified by ritual. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the feeling of wind across the open prairie, the sound of her horse's hooves on hard-packed earth, the simple pleasure of watching sunrise paint the sky in colors that had no names. These memories were all she had left now, the only treasures they could not steal from her, the only sanctuary they could not violate with their hatred. As Crane raised his hand to signal the beginning of the end, Sarah opened her eyes and looked out across the faces of her accusers, seeing in them the reflection of every mob that had ever gathered to destroy what it could not understand. And she knew that her death would change nothing, that tomorrow they would find another target for their fear, another scapegoat for their failures, another woman who dared to live outside the narrow boundaries they had drawn around acceptable existence. The thunder of hoofbeats cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, and every head in the crowd turned toward the sound as if pulled by invisible strings. Garrett Thorne rode into Bitter Creek with the fury of a man who had seen too much injustice in his 35 years, his horse's flanks heaving from the hard ride that had brought him here just as the sun reached its merciless peak. He had heard the rumors in the last town, whispered words about a witch trial that had made his blood run cold with memories of other places, other times when fear had worn the mask of righteousness and innocent people had paid the price. The sight that greeted him in the town square confirmed his worst fears. A woman bound to a post like some medieval sacrifice, her dignity stripped away by men who called themselves godly while acting like demons. His knife was in his hand before his boots hit the ground, the steel singing as it cleared the leather sheath with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that sometimes salvation came at the point of a blade. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, their righteous fury suddenly uncertain in the face of his cold determination, their voices faltering as they recognized the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Garrett had seen enough of the world to know that mobs were cowards at heart, brave only when their victims were helpless, quick to scatter when faced with someone willing to stand against them. The preacher opened his mouth to protest, to invoke the authority of God and law, but Garrett's glare silenced him as effectively as a hand across his throat. The rope parted under his blade like it was made of spider's silk rather than hemp, and Sarah felt the bonds fall away from her wrists with a relief so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. She had expected to die in this place, had made her peace with the idea of becoming another casualty in humanity's endless war against difference, but now she found herself free, her rescuer standing between her and the crowd like a wall of flesh and determination. Garrett's presence filled the space around them with a kind of electric tension, his very stillness more threatening than any violence, his silence more powerful than any words he might have spoken. The crowd sensed the change in the air, the shift from certain victory to uncertain outcome, and their bloodlust began to waver like a flame in the wind. But as Sarah's torn chemise fell away from her shoulders, revealing the pale skin that had been hidden beneath the rough fabric, Garrett's attention was caught by something that made his breath catch in his throat like a fishhook. There, nestled in the hollow between her collarbones, hung a silver locket that seemed to catch and hold the sunlight like a mirror, its surface worn smooth by years of wear and marked with an intricate pattern that he knew as well as his own heartbeat. His hand moved instinctively to his own chest, to the place where an identical locket rested against his skin, hidden beneath his shirt, but never forgotten, never ignored, a constant reminder of the sister he had lost 20 years ago when their family had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. The world seemed to stop turning as Garrett stared at the locket, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The crowd faded into background noise, their shouts and protests becoming nothing more than the buzzing of insects, irrelevant and distant compared to the earthquake that was reshaping his understanding of everything he thought he knew. Sarah's face, which he had seen only as the face of an innocent woman in need of rescue, suddenly took on new dimensions, new meanings, as he searched for traces of the little girl he had been forced to leave behind when their parents died, and the world had scattered their family like leaves in a storm. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the stubborn set of her jaw, all of it spoke to him in a language older than words, deeper than memory. Time stretched like taffy as Garrett reached out with trembling fingers to touch the locket, his callous skin brushing against the warm silver that had rested against his sister's heart for all these years, and he felt the last 20 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope, collapse into this single moment of recognition that would change everything he thought he knew about his place in the world and the meaning of the choices he had made. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire between them, heavy with the weight of 20 years and all the words that had never been spoken. Sarah's eyes, wide with recognition and something deeper, relief perhaps, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret too long, searched his face as if trying to find traces of the boy she had once known in the weathered features of the man who stood before her. Garrett's hands trembled as he reached toward the locket, his fingers stopping just short of touching the silver surface that caught the dying light like a mirror reflecting back all the nights he had stared at his own identical pendant, wondering if she was alive, if she was safe, if she remembered the promise they had made beneath the old oak tree behind their childhood home. The crowd around them seemed to fade into a distant murmur, their angry voices becoming nothing more than the buzz of insects against the enormity of this moment, this impossible convergence of fate and blood that had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper, cracked with emotion and the rawness of her ordeal, but it carried in it all the tenderness of their shared past and the pain of their long separation. "Garrett," she said, and the way she spoke his name was like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for too long, opening doors to memories he had tried to bury beneath years of solitary living and the harsh realities of frontier life. He could see in her eyes the same fierce independence that had driven her to run away all those years ago, the same stubborn refusal to bend to anyone's will that had apparently led her to this moment, bound to a post and accused of crimes that existed only in the fevered imaginations of frightened people. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had spent 2 decades searching for her, had found her in the moment when she needed him most, when the very qualities that had driven her away had brought her to the edge of death. The crowd began to stir restlessly, their bloodlust temporarily confused by this unexpected interruption, but Garrett could feel their attention sharpening again, their collective anger seeking a new target now that their original victim had been freed. He knew they would not be satisfied with simply letting her go, that their need for someone to blame for their troubles would not be so easily dismissed. And he could see in the faces around them the dangerous shift from religious fervor to mob mentality. Sarah seemed to sense it too, her body tensing as she pulled the torn remnants of her dress closer around herself, her eyes darting between the hostile faces that surrounded them like a pack of wolves circling wounded prey. The locket lay against her chest like a talisman, its silver surface now seeming to pulse with its own inner light, a beacon of connection in a world that had suddenly become alien and threatening to them both. Garrett's mind raced through possibilities, calculating distances to his horse, weighing the odds of fighting their way clear against the certainty that violence would only confirm their suspicions about Sarah's supposed dark powers. He could feel the weight of his gun at his hip, but he knew that drawing it would be a declaration of war against the entire settlement, and even his skill with a weapon would not be enough against so many. The smart thing would be to talk their way out, to use reason and logic to diffuse the situation, but he could see, in the glazed eyes of the crowd, that reason had long since fled this place, replaced by the kind of fear that made people capable of terrible things. Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch light but urgent, and he could feel in that contact all the years of separation and the desperate need for connection that had driven them both through the long, lonely years since they had been torn apart. The preacher stepped forward again, his face twisted with righteous indignation and something else, a personal affront at having his authority challenged in front of his followers. "You dare interfere with God's justice, stranger?" he demanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his conviction and the dangerous edge of a man whose power has been publicly questioned. Garrett could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the way he was already working to turn this interruption to his advantage, to paint Garrett as another agent of darkness sent to protect the witch. The crowd murmured its agreement, their voices rising like the sound of approaching thunder, and Garrett knew that they were balanced on the edge of a precipice, that one wrong word or gesture could send them all tumbling into violence and chaos from which there might be no return. Sarah's grip on his arm tightened, and when he looked down at her, he saw not the frightened victim he might have expected, but the same determined girl who had once declared she would rather die than live according to someone else's rules. The same fierce spirit that had driven her into the wilderness 20 years ago and had somehow sustained her through whatever trials had brought her to this moment. In her eyes, he could see a reflection of his own resolve, a shared understanding that they had found each other again, not to surrender to the fears and prejudices of others, but to stand together against whatever forces sought to tear them apart, just as they should have done all those years ago when the world first tried to separate them and they were too young and too powerless to fight back. The preacher's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Garrett felt something shift inside him, a transformation as profound and irreversible as the moment when a boy becomes a man or when innocence gives way to the hard wisdom of experience. He had spent 20 years learning to be alone, teaching himself to need no one and to expect nothing from a world that had already taken everything that mattered to him. But standing here with Sarah's hand on his arm and her locket catching the last rays of sunlight, he remembered what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a sea of suspicion and barely contained violence. But for the first time in years, Garrett felt no fear, only a cold clarity that settled over him like armor, forged from all the nights he had lain awake, wondering if she was alive. All the mornings he had awakened, hoping this would be the day he found her trail, all the prayers he had whispered to a God who had seemed deaf to his pleas, until this moment. Sarah straightened beside him, and despite her torn clothing and the marks of rough treatment on her wrists and arms, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to shine brighter than the silver at her throat. "I am no witch," she said, her voice carrying across the square with a strength that belied her ordeal, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the crowd. "I am a woman who has lived free in the wilderness, who has learned the ways of plants and animals, who has helped where I could and harmed no one." Her eyes swept the faces around them, meeting each gaze with unflinching directness, and Garrett could see some of the certainty beginning to waver in the expressions of those who had been so eager for her blood just moments before. "If your crops have failed, look to your own neglect, your own greed, your own refusal to work with the land instead of against it." The preacher's face darkened at her words, and Garrett could see the man's desperation to maintain control over his flock, to keep them focused on their need for a scapegoat, rather than allowing them to consider the possibility that their troubles might have more mundane causes. "The devil speaks through her even now," the preacher declared, his voice rising to compete with the growing murmur of uncertainty that was spreading through the crowd like cracks in a dam. "See how she seeks to turn you against the righteous path, to make you doubt the clear evidence of her evil influence." But even as he spoke, Garrett could see that some of the fire had gone out of the crowd's anger, replaced by the uncomfortable stirring of people who were beginning to question whether they had been about to commit murder in the name of justice. Garrett stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sarah, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun, in a gesture that was both protective and warning. "I know this woman," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had learned to make his words count, who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful statements were the ones delivered without shouting. "She is my sister, lost to me for 20 years, and I can tell you that there is no evil in her except in the minds of those who fear what they do not understand." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, and he could feel Sarah's surprise and gratitude flowing toward him like warmth from a fire. "If you want to condemn someone for witchcraft, then you'll have to condemn me as well, because we share the same blood, the same family, the same God who has seen fit to bring us together again in this place." Udry. The crowd shifted uneasily, their collective certainty beginning to crumble in the face of this unexpected revelation, and Garrett could see the preacher's growing desperation as he realized that his carefully orchestrated spectacle was slipping away from him. Some of the women in the crowd were looking at Sarah with something approaching sympathy now, perhaps remembering their own daughters or sisters, their own fears of being alone and vulnerable in a world that offered little protection to women who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior. The men were calculating odds and consequences, weighing their desire for someone to blame against the very real possibility that they were about to make enemies of people who might be more dangerous than they appeared. The children, wide-eyed and confused, clung to their parents' hands and tried to understand why the adults around them seemed so angry and frightened. Sarah's voice, when she spoke again, was softer but no less determined, carrying in it all the pain of their separation and the fierce joy of their reunion. "Garrett found me because he never stopped looking, never stopped believing that family was worth searching for, worth fighting for," she said. Her words aimed not just at the crowd, but at something deeper, some fundamental truth about loyalty and love that transcended the petty fears and prejudices that had brought them to this moment. "If that is witchcraft, then it is the kind of magic that this world needs more of, not less." Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of siblings who had once been inseparable, and Garrett felt something inside him that had been broken for 20 years finally begin to heal. "We have done nothing but survive, nothing but try to find our way back to each other in a world that seems determined to keep families apart." The preacher made one last, desperate attempt to regain control, raising his voice in a final appeal to the crowd's baser instincts, but Garrett could see that the moment had passed, that whatever spell of fear and hatred had held these people in its grip was finally beginning to break. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead, and in that dying light, brother and sister stood together for the first time in 20 years, no longer alone, no longer searching, finally ready to face whatever challenges the world might throw at them, with the strength that came from knowing they would never have to face them alone again. The crowd began to disperse slowly, like smoke dissipating in a gentle wind, their earlier bloodlust replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of how close they had come to committing an irreversible act of violence against an innocent woman. Garrett watched them go with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness, knowing that while the immediate danger had passed, the underlying fears and prejudices that had brought them to this point would not disappear so easily. Sarah stood beside him, her hand still clasped in his, and he could feel the tremor of exhaustion and emotional overwhelm that ran through her slender frame, the delayed reaction to an ordeal that would have broken a lesser spirit. The preacher retreated with his most devoted followers, his face dark with frustrated rage and the bitter taste of public defeat. But Garrett knew that men like him did not forget such humiliations easily, and that they would need to be far from this place before the man's wounded pride could reassert itself in more dangerous ways. As the square emptied, leaving only scattered debris and the lingering smell of fear and sweat, Garrett turned his full attention to his sister for the first time, really looking at her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl he remembered from their childhood. She was thinner than she should be, marked by years of hard living and the kind of self-reliance that came from having no one to depend on but herself. But her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence and stubborn independence that had driven her to leave home all those years ago. Her hair, once the same dark brown as his own, was now streaked with premature silver, and her hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who had learned to survive by her own efforts, but she was unmistakably the sister he had lost, the missing piece of his heart that he had carried with him through 2 decades of searching and hoping and refusing to give up. "I never thought I would see you again," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. And in those words, Garrett could hear all the loneliness and longing that had marked her years in the wilderness. All the nights she had looked up at the same stars he had been watching and wondered if he was still alive, still searching, still remembering the promise they had made to always find each other, no matter how far apart the world might take them. "There were times when I almost convinced myself that you had forgotten me, that you had built a new life without the burden of a sister who had brought nothing but trouble to your family." Her fingers tightened around his, as if she were afraid that he might disappear like a mirage if she let go, and Garrett felt his heart break a little at the thought of all the years she had spent believing herself forgotten and alone. "Never," he said, the word coming out rougher than he intended, weighted with all the emotion he had kept locked away for so long. "Not a single day passed that I didn't think of you, didn't wonder where you were, and if you were safe." He reached up with his free hand to touch the locket at his own throat, the twin to the one she wore, and saw her eyes follow the movement with a mixture of surprise and deep, abiding relief. "I kept this as a reminder, as a promise that I would never stop looking, never stop believing that someday we would find each other again." The admission felt like a confession, like the lifting of a weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight without it, and he could see in Sarah's face that she understood the depth of his commitment, the price he had paid in loneliness and isolation for his refusal to give up hope. They stood together in the gathering dusk, 2 people who had been shaped by loss and separation, but who had somehow managed to hold on to the essential core of who they were, the unbreakable bond that had sustained them through the darkest years of their lives. Garrett could feel the years falling away between them, the accumulated pain and loneliness dissolving in the simple miracle of being together again, of knowing that the search was over and the healing could finally begin. Sarah leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder the way it had when they were children, and the world had seemed like a place full of endless possibilities rather than dangers to be survived, and he wrapped his arms around her with a gentleness that surprised him, as if he were afraid she might break or disappear if he held her too tightly. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder, and Garrett could hear in the question all the uncertainty and hope of someone who had lived so long without a future that she had almost forgotten how to imagine one. He looked out at the horizon, where the last light of day was painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and for the first time in 20 years he could see beyond the next hill, beyond the next town, beyond the endless cycle of searching and disappointment that had defined his adult life. "Now we go home," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what home meant anymore, whether it was a place they could return to or something they would have to build together from the ground up. "We find a place where we can be family again, where we can learn to trust that the world won't tear us apart a second time." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been the beginning of hope, the first tentative stirring of a future that included more than mere survival. "I've forgotten how to be anyone's sister," she admitted, her voice carrying the vulnerability of someone who had learned to be strong for so long that she had almost forgotten how to accept help or comfort from another person. "I've been alone for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be part of something larger than myself." Garrett smiled then, the first real smile he had worn in years, and reached up to touch her face with the same gentle care he might have shown a wounded bird. "Then we'll learn together," he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found his purpose again. "We'll take it one day at a time, one step at a time, until being family feels as natural as breathing again." As they walked toward his horse, their steps synchronized in the unconscious harmony of siblings who had once moved through the world as two halves of a single whole, Garrett felt something shift in the very fabric of his existence, a fundamental reordering of priorities and possibilities that made the future seem bright with promise for the first time in decades. The road ahead would not be easy. They both carried scars that would take time to heal, habits of solitude that would need to be unlearned, fears that would have to be faced and overcome. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference in a world that had taught them both that the most precious things were often the most fragile, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply the willingness to hope for something better than what you had known before.